What if I told you that behind the glittering halls of the Spanish court, one queen's beauty and charm were not celebrated but despised? That a woman, admired in her youth, would later be remembered as one of the most hated queens in Spanish history, blamed for dragging her kingdom into decline. That woman was Maria Luisa of Parma. Born in 1751 in Parma, Italy, Maria Luisa grew up surrounded by the elegance of Italian courts. The daughter of Duke Philip of Parma and Princess Louise Elizabeth of France, she inherited both Bourbon blood and French refinement. From an early age, she was trained not just to be a duchess, but a queen in the making. Music, art, diplomacy, and courtly manners were instilled into her, painting the image of a perfect royal bride. At 13, her path was already sealed. She was chosen to marry Charles, Prince of Asturias, heir to the Spanish throne. To many, this seemed like a perfect union, an alliance between Italian and Spanish Bourbon branches, strengthening the dynasty's control over Europe. But history would prove that this marriage, celebrated with lavish feasts and processions, was not the fairy tale it appeared to be. When Maria Luisa arrived in Spain, the court admired her youthful beauty, her lively character, and her Italian grace. She stood out in the rigid, almost suffocating atmosphere of the Spanish monarchy. While King Charles Roman III embodied austerity and discipline, his daughter-in-law brought color, passion, and unpredictability. Yet this very brightness would soon cast long shadows, for while some adored her, many others whispered. She was foreign, she was outspoken, she defied traditions that Spanish courtiers held sacred, and as her husband, the future King Charles Roman IV, grew increasingly dependent on her, the people began to see not a queen consort, but a queen who ruled from behind the throne. It was this perception that Maria Luisa pulled the strings of power that would follow her throughout her life, fueling both resentment and hatred. But before she became the symbol of Bourbon decline, she was still just a young bride trying to navigate the treacherous waters of a foreign court. The stage was set, a beautiful queen, a weak king, a nation already trembling under the weight of change, and in this fragile balance, Maria Luisa of Parma would soon become one of the most controversial figures in Spanish history. To understand why Maria Luisa of Parma became both influential and despised, we need to look at the world she entered, the people who surrounded her, the power struggles at court, and the fragile society of 18th-century Spain. At the heart of her story stood her husband, Charles Roman IV of Spain. Charles was not the image of a commanding monarch, gentle, good-natured, and far from ambitious. He was more interested in hunting and mechanical hobbies than in the demanding art of governance. He lacked the sharp intellect and political instinct that his father, Charles Roman III, had carried with discipline and resolve. For many, it was obvious. Charles would be a king who leaned heavily on his advisors, and above all, his wife. Maria Luisa quickly realized her role. Unlike many queens consort who remained in the shadows, she stepped into the vacuum left by her husband's passivity. She was sharp, decisive, and fiery. She did not hesitate to voice her opinions, often clashing with conservative courtiers who were unaccustomed to a woman's boldness in politics. But her rise to prominence was not just about her personality. It was also about the company she kept. Enter Manuel de Godoy, a young guard of the corps who would become the most infamous figure of Maria Luisa's reign. Charismatic, handsome, and ambitious, Godoy quickly earned the queen's favor and soon after the king's trust. Whispers spread through Madrid that Maria Luisa's relationship with Godoy was far more than political. Was he her confidant, her lover, or simply a tool she used to shape Spanish politics? The rumors never died, and they fueled the fire of hatred against her. Yet Godoy was not the only factor. The Bourbon dynasty itself was under immense pressure. Spain was grappling with economic stagnation, a decaying empire, and the spreading shock waves of the French Revolution. In such turbulent times, every royal decision was magnified, every mistake criticized. And when Charles Roman IV faltered, Maria Luisa and Godoy became the easy scapegoats. But beyond court politics, life in Spain carried its own rhythms. Imagine Madrid in the late 18th century, narrow cobblestone streets echoing with the sound of carriages, taverns filled with songs of common folk, and the bustling markets alive with traders from across the empire. While the elites whispered in the palaces of Aranjuez and El Escorial, ordinary Spaniards lived with poverty, high taxes, and uncertainty about the future. For them, the queen's extravagant dresses, Italian accent, and rumored affairs became symbols of everything that was wrong with the monarchy. It was a dangerous cocktail: a weak king, a strong-willed queen, an ambitious favorite, and a restless people. Together, they set the stage for a political storm that would shake the Bourbon dynasty to its core. And soon, that storm would break with a dramatic turn of events, when revolutions abroad and betrayals at home collided with Maria Luisa's reign. The late 18th century was a dangerous time to wear a crown. Across Europe, thrones trembled as whispers of revolution spread like wildfire, and for Maria Luisa of Parma, the storm brewing in Paris would soon crash down upon Madrid. In 1789, the French Revolution erupted, toppling the very monarchy that had once been her mother's homeland. The Bourbon cousins in France faced the guillotine, and suddenly, every king and queen in Europe felt the tremors. For Spain, ruled by a weak king and an unpopular queen, the revolution was not just a distant fire, it was a warning of what could come. Maria Luisa's instinct was survival. She and Charles Roman IV leaned more and more on Manuel de Godoy, the young court favorite who promised loyalty and swift decisions. But the more power Godoy accumulated, the more hatred grew among nobles, clergy, and commoners alike. They saw him as the queen's puppet, or worse, her lover. Then came 1793. Spain declared war on revolutionary France in what became known as the War of the Pyrenees. At first, patriotic fervor swept through Spain, but the war turned disastrous. Spanish armies were crushed, resources drained, and the people began to suffer even more. Who was to blame? To many, it was simple: the queen who had pushed her husband into relying on Godoy. Godoy who had led Spain into defeat. By 1795, Spain signed the humiliating Peace of Basel, ceding territory and prestige. Godoy was given the mocking title of Prince of the Peace. For Maria Luisa, this was a turning point. Instead of admiration, the people spat her name with contempt. Pamphlets and satirical prints circulated through Madrid, mocking her Italian origins, her supposed infidelity, and her extravagance. But the greatest blow was yet to come. In 1808, Napoleon Bonaparte cast his shadow over Spain. Seizing the weakness of the Spanish monarchy, Napoleon maneuvered the royal family into a trap, forcing both Charles Roman IV and his son Ferdinand to abdicate in favor of his brother Joseph Bonaparte. For Spaniards, this betrayal was unforgivable, and once again they pointed their fingers at Maria Luisa. To them, she was not the queen who protected Spain, but the foreign woman who had corrupted it, who had allowed her lover to steer the country into ruin, and who had failed to defend her people from French domination. The once celebrated Princess of Parma had now become a symbol of Spain's humiliation. Imagine the scene: Madrid in revolt, the people rising against foreign occupation, while the royal family fled into exile. And at the center of this chaos stood Maria Luisa, the queen who had once dazzled with beauty, now cursed as the woman who planted the seeds of Bourbon decline. Exile is one of history's cruelest punishments for royalty. For Maria Luisa of Parma, once draped in silk and jewels, it was the final humiliation. After Napoleon's intervention in 1808, the Spanish royal family was forced to abandon Madrid. They wandered first into France, effectively prisoners of Napoleon, before being exiled to Rome under papal protection. Once powerful rulers of an empire stretching across oceans, Charles Roman IV and Maria Luisa now lived as shadows of their former selves. In Spain, however, their downfall was greeted not with sorrow, but with relief and anger. Ordinary people had long felt the weight of crushing taxes, endless wars, and food shortages. With famine at their doors and foreign troops in their streets, they needed someone to blame. That blame fell squarely on Maria Luisa and her favorite, Godoy. In taverns, she was mocked as the Italian witch. In pamphlets, she was depicted as an immoral queen who placed her pleasures above the nation. Tales spread of her alleged affairs, her extravagance, and her supposed schemes with Godoy. Even though much of it was gossip, the narrative stuck. For a suffering people, it was easier to picture a corrupt queen than to face the complexity of European politics. Nobles, too, found it convenient to despise her. They resented the rise of Godoy. A man of humble origins who climbed the ranks thanks to Maria Luisa's favor. For them, the queen had not only failed to protect Spain's honor, but had also broken the sacred hierarchy of aristocratic privilege. Meanwhile, Maria Luisa herself grew bitter in exile. She had lost not only her throne, but also the respect of her people and the security of her legacy. Yet she never admitted fault to her. She was a queen who had loved her country and supported her weak husband, but history rarely judges with mercy. The Spanish War of Independence, 1808–1814, waged against Napoleon's brother Joseph, unfolded without her. Spaniards rose in a brutal guerrilla war that would inspire generations. They fought not for Maria Luisa or Charles Roman IV, but for themselves, for Spain. In their eyes, the Bourbon rulers had abandoned them. As the years dragged on, Maria Luisa's reputation hardened into legend, the legend of a queen whose beauty hid corruption, whose love for a favorite destroyed a monarchy, and whose foreign birth made her forever an outsider. Yet, exile did not erase her completely. She remained in correspondence with allies, scheming, plotting, and clinging to the hope of restoration. And though her body aged, her spirit burned with the same fierceness that had once lit up the Spanish court. But history would give her no redemption. Instead, her name became a warning, an example of how quickly love could turn to hatred, and how one queen's choices could stain an entire dynasty. Every queen leaves behind a legacy, whether of triumph, tragedy, or scandal. For Maria Luisa of Parma, her legacy was a mix of myth, warning, and enduring controversy. Historians today still debate, was she truly the scheming, adulterous queen that her enemies described, or was she simply a strong-willed woman trapped in a weak monarchy? The truth may lie somewhere in between. One lesson from Maria Luisa's story is the danger of perception. In politics, image often matters as much as reality. Whether or not she truly had an affair with Godoy, whether or not she deliberately weakened Spain, the perception of her actions destroyed her reputation. A queen seen as foreign, extravagant, and manipulative was an easy target for blame, especially in times of crisis. Another lesson is the fragility of dynasties. The Bourbon monarchy in Spain was already weakened by economic stagnation, social unrest, and the shock waves of revolution in France. Maria Luisa became a convenient symbol of decline, but the truth is that the problems ran far deeper than one woman. Still, her influence and her closeness to Godoy pushed her directly into the storm of history. And yet Maria Luisa did leave behind tangible traces. Portraits of her by Francisco Goya, Spain's great painter, still hang in museums today. In them we see a queen not of myth, but of flesh and blood, sometimes adorned with jewels, sometimes shown with her family. She is frozen in oil and canvas, forever watched by future generations. Goya himself was rumored to dislike her, yet his art immortalized her presence more powerfully than any pamphlet or rumor could. Her story also shaped Spanish memory. For decades, she was invoked as a cautionary tale, a queen who allowed personal ambition and favoritism to undermine the crown, even today. Spanish historians remember her as one of the monarchy's most controversial figures, but perhaps the greatest legacy she left was the fall of Bourbon Spain itself. The dynasty that had ruled for centuries was broken by Napoleon's intervention. Though it would eventually be restored, it returned scarred, weakened, and forever haunted by the memory of the queen who was blamed for its collapse. Looking back, Maria Luisa's tale is not only about scandal, it is about power, love, and the weight of history pressing down on one woman's shoulders. She was both victim and villain, a queen of contradictions. And that is why her name still lingers today, not in glory, but in fascination. Maria Luisa of Parma's life came to an end far from the power and pageantry of Madrid. She died in Rome in 1819, only a year before her husband Charles Roman IV. Once the most powerful woman in Spain, she passed away in quiet exile, her reputation in tatters. No crowds mourned her, no nation paused to honor her. For most Spaniards, her death was a footnote, an ending to a chapter they would rather forget. But was her downfall entirely fair? History often judges women in power more harshly than men. Maria Luisa was ambitious, outspoken, and unwilling to remain in the shadows of her husband. Qualities that might have been praised in a king became scandalous in a queen. Had Charles Roman IV been a stronger monarch, perhaps she would never have been blamed for Spain's collapse, but paired with a passive king, her influence was magnified and her faults exaggerated, even today. Mysteries linger. Was her relationship with Manuel de Godoy truly romantic, or was it simply political partnership misinterpreted by her enemies? Did she consciously guide Spain toward disaster, or was she just swept away by forces larger than herself? The revolution in France, the rise of Napoleon, the decline of empire. What we do know is this: Maria Luisa remains one of the most controversial queens in European history, a woman of beauty and fire, remembered more for hatred than admiration, a queen whose name became synonymous with betrayal, scandal, and decline. Yet in her story we also glimpse the tragedy of a dynasty that could not withstand the tidal wave of change sweeping across Europe. Perhaps the final irony is this: while her enemies sought to erase her, her legacy endures. Every time we look at Goya's portraits, every time her name appears in a history book, every time we ask whether she was villain or victim, Maria Luisa of Parma lives again. And maybe that is the truest mark of power: not glory, not love, but the ability to be remembered, debated, and feared long after death. But one question still lingers unanswered. Was Maria Luisa truly the poison at the heart of Bourbon Spain, or was she simply the easiest scapegoat for a monarchy already doomed to fall? But is that really the whole story?